Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Adam Braff, who is returning to the show. Adam's a former McKinsey partner. He runs a data and analytics consulting firm called Braff and Co. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Will. It's great to be back.
So, Adam, I think we were planning to talk about forecasting today, and I'm really interested. You were telling me before we started recording that you've been running a forecasting contest with your friends for 6 years. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it started with Philip Tetlock's book, which came out about 6 years ago, Super Forecasting, which perhaps you also, but I and a bunch of my friends read, and we were all really interested in what Tetlock had to say about forecasting contests and about how to become a better forecaster. So I launched the initial contest in 2016, where I set out a bunch of propositions for people to predict yes or no, would they happen or not, and got a few dozen entries that year and scored them, and the rest is history.
What sort of questions did you ask people to forecast?
They are binary propositions on a number of different topics. So we will have questions ranging from entertainment, like who's going to win or will a specific artist win the Grammy Awards or the Oscars, to sports, will a certain team or conference win the Super Bowl, to celebrity deaths and business and everything in between. So the goal of picking the topics is to select topics where no one forecaster would have an inherent advantage because they are a deep expert in politics or business, and to make sure that the propositions would play out over the course of the year so that we have the entertainment value of keeping track of the leaderboard as they go.
And what have you learned over the past 6 years of running this experiment?
Well, for one thing, it's really hard to make these forecasts. I should explain a little bit in more detail how the contest plays out. At the beginning of the year in January, I crowdsource these propositions. I ask my Facebook and LinkedIn network to give me a bunch of topics for the year to come. And most of them are typically about Donald Trump or about the environment or about certain other celebrities. And I curate those and put them together into a set of 25 binary propositions that are going to play out over the year. So, for example, last year, because everything was happening in January, there were no propositions that were directly about the COVID-19 pandemic. Nobody even knew what that was in January in the US. So we had propositions like, by March 15th, Lori Loughlin will be sentenced to or will reach a plea agreement entailing at least a year in prison for her role in the Varsity Blues scandal. Or there would be a prop that says Japan will finish within the top 3 nations in the 2020 Olympics total medal count. There was a proposition that on September 1st, Scarlett Johansson and Colin Jost would be married to each other. So the process is to set those props out, and then I make my own forecasts from 0 to 100% likely that this thing will happen. And all the other contestants make their own forecasts of 0 to 100%. And we all do this separately. They submit the forecast through a form, and I put it all together and then maintain a somewhat automatically running leaderboard of who's ahead and who's behind based on something called a Breyer score, which is the square of the error in anyone's forecast. And I can explain that in a little more detail if you like.
Yeah, I'd like to understand that. So it's one thing if it was just yes or no, it'll happen, but how do you factor in all these percentages? If someone says something is 60% likely to happen and it does or it doesn't, then how does that affect their score?
Yeah, so if you bet 60% on the ScarJo, or I guess the JoJo proposition of Scarlett Johansson being married by September 1st, and if it had turned out that they did get married before that date, then that would resolve as a yes. And the true answer then is is 1, and your forecast of 60% is 0.6. So your distance to the correct answer, the error in your forecast, is 0.4, because that's 1 minus 0.6. And the Brier score is simply that 0.4 squared. So you would get a score of 0.16 for that forecast. If they didn't get married before September 1st, which in fact wasn't the case, they got married after that date, then the prop would resolve as a no or a 0, and your error would be 0.6. So 0.6 squared is 0.36, and that would be your Brier score. So the lower, the better, and your goal is to try to get a Brier score below, let's say, 0.1 across all of the propositions in order to win the contest.
So you really are incentivized to, if you think it's going to happen, to guess as high as possible, 80% or 90%, because if you just hedge and guess 50% on everything, you'd by definition get a 0.25 score on everything, and you would lose. So you're really trying to guess as high as possible if you think it's going to win, or low as possible if you think it's not going to happen.
That's right. It's kind of a tax on overconfidence. The fact that we square the error. It's what's called a strictly proper scoring system, where you have an incentive to make a truly accurate forecast based on what you really think the probability is, and trying to game the system by cheating toward 50% or cheating toward the extremes only punishes you in the long run. But you're absolutely right. A person who guesses 50% down the line will guarantee a Brier score of 0.25. And interestingly, every year, more than half of the participants in the contest get a worse Brier score than 0.25. They do worse than if they had simply predicted 50% down the line. And that's a fascinating point about one of the lessons learned, which is about overconfidence.
Yeah, so you don't want to be overconfident either. So it does incentivize you, if you really have no idea, just guess 50%.
Exactly. Now, you can make that choice at an individual level. So if there's a question that comes up at the contest, let's say every year there's some question about cryptocurrencies, right? So this year there is an ongoing proposition in the contest which says 1 Bitcoin will be worth more than 20 troy ounces of gold at the end of the first quarter. So we're having this conversation in March of 2021, right? But the value of Bitcoin at the post time when the contest was taking people's predictions in January was 20 ounces of gold to a Bitcoin, basically. That's whatever that was at the time, $30,000. And it has since skyrocketed to about 30 ounces of gold. Bitcoin's gone up much faster than gold has done. But that's the kind of proposition where a reasonable person back in January would say, I don't know if Bitcoin's going to go up or down. I also don't know if gold's going to go up or down. I'm not a currency trader, and I certainly am not an expert in the relative value of these two financial instruments. So perhaps the right epistemic position to have on that is, that's 50%. I'm going to cut my losses and move on and not waste any more time predicting that one. I don't know if I'm a trend follower or a mean reverter on this thing, so 50% is a good guess on that one. You can do that kind of thinking for each individual proposition until you come to a proposition where you feel like you have either some information advantage or some way of making a sharper forecast.
So this is a really interesting exercise, because often in consulting, we are asked to make some kind of forecast on things. And my feeling often has been, this is just complete non-useful for the client. Like, so often on maybe a commercial due diligence to say, okay, what's the market growth rate forecast for the next 5 years? Something like that. Like, I mean, look, I can pull it from some report, but honestly, that's just not really worth the paper it's written on. Like, who knows, right? You could say, well, it's been 5%, 6%, 8% for the last 6 years, but maybe it's run its course. Who knows? But they always want to see that. So you put something in. But this is actually testing and determining if you were correct or not. And so what have you learned about forecasting from this, from this whole process? Are people able to get better over time? Are some people just consistently better than others? What differentiates those who are good from those who are lousy?
I would say there are probably 5 things that differentiate the good from the lousy, and then you can have the debate about which way the causal arrow runs. But there are certainly some factors that repeatedly show up as correlating with having a good performance, which is to say a persistently low Brier score. And the first is this question we talked about earlier about making extreme forecasts. Every year, there are a number of people, we call them extremists, who make more than half of their forecasts as literally 0 or 100%. Now, just think about that for a second, right? If I were to look at the proposition that said last year, Billie Eilish is going to win Best Album and Best New Artist in the 2020 Grammy Awards, which she ended up doing. That's not a 0% or 100% proposition. Whatever you may think about her music, there is an actual betting market on those things. You can look at the independent probabilities of that happening. And at the time, it was I think it was roughly 50-50 that she would win both, and so she did. But if you're an extremist and you're committed to the idea that you're going to put zeros and hundreds because you think that's the only way to win a forecasting contest, you're going to lose. And it's simply the math of how many participants there are, how many questions there are, and it just doesn't pay to enter extreme forecasts that deviate from what you think is the right answer. So you ultimately, the people who win the contest will have no more than 2 or 3 forecasts at the 0 or 100 level out of 25. The next factor is teamwork. So it's really good to work in a team. People who report that they collaborated on their forecasts around the family table tend to perform better than people who work by themselves. And they're sharing different viewpoints, they're arguing about stuff, they're correcting each other's mistakes to some extent, and working out their errors that way. In fact, when you make an ensemble of all the forecasts, you get the wisdom of the crowds. That routinely does very well, kind of top 5 performance across all of the forecasters, because teamwork really makes a difference. The third thing I would say is making an effort and actually doing a bit of research into the base rate of things, right? So in your example of a commercial due diligence, looking at the historical growth rate of what sales have been is better than nothing, right? And certainly starting with it used to grow at 7 or 8% it puts you ahead of somebody who is going to look at, let's say, GDP growing at 2% and using that as their forecast. So putting in some work to do at least a bit of research into what your forecast should be is better than not doing it. And I say this because one of the questions I ask on the contest submission form is, did you make your picks at random, like one of my kids does every year, or do you put some work into it? And I found that I personally spend, between 2 and 4 hours on one, weekend day in January making my forecast, and that has served me well. The fourth thing that correlates with doing well is wagering. So being in the habit of making bets in casinos or with your friends or entering previous forecasting contests definitely makes you better over time. We make a lot of bets in our house. My kids are constantly betting with each other over everything, over what's the next thing that mom's going to say when she walks into the room, or do narwhals exist? So we generally are getting better at Bayesian thinking by constantly wagering, and that correlates with a good performance. And then the last thing I would say is overconfidence is the killer. We talked about extremism, but also subject matter experts do not do particularly better than anyone else in the domain of their expertise. So I ask people when they submit their entry, are you an expert in any of the following topics? World politics, business, crime. We always have a lot of questions about crime. And typically the Brier scores on people's questions in their area of expertise are not better than average. But what is true is there is a generalized super forecasting skill set. And there's a group of people that I call super forecasters locally within this contest who routinely do very well in making their predictions. And in fact, an ensemble of their predictions does even better than the wisdom of the overall crowd.
what types of so tell me a little bit more about like the teamwork and the research that people do. Um, in terms of research, I can imagine some of the things like, okay, how gold rates trended, or the price of gold over time, how much variability it is, or how volatile. But something like, when will two people get married? How would you think about researching those kind of topics to make a prediction?
The ones about marriages and births are very tricky. And there's a difference between using what Tetlock calls the outside view, which is a base rate of similar people in similar circumstances and how often they've acted in certain ways, versus the inside view, which is to study this particular person or this particular couple and to try to predict what's happening to them. So often there'll be a proposition about the Kanye West Kim Kardashian marriage. I think that's come up twice now. We have a pending proposition on that, which is that they will be living together on the 7th anniversary of their wedding, coming up in May. That's looking like a no right now. So the outside view on those celebrity marriages, that one and the JoJo marriage, is really tough, right? Because you can look at the base rate of divorces in California and marriages and say, well, any two people who are dating for a certain amount of time are likely to get engaged or to get married within X months of it. You could certainly hunt that kind of data down. In the case of doing this research, if you only have a limited amount of time to spend on it, you probably aren't going to want to spend a lot of your research time on trying to find the right reference class of celebrities in California and what their marriage rate is relative to when they first met. But you could certainly do worse than that. There are other propositions, though, where research makes a really big difference, because you'll find out that there is an active betting market on the topic, right? So one of the propositions last year was, will Greta Thunberg win the Nobel Peace Prize? There's a betting market on the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a pretty active market. There are multiple betting markets on that. And so it was certainly possible at post time in January to look at the odds of that and say, yeah, she's very likely to win. And that was, of course, before the pandemic, which changed the odds. And then the winner turned out to be related to neither Greta Thunberg nor the pandemic. But certainly there is an amount of research that you can do to hunt down relevant betting markets. There's also probably a wider range of cases to take the outside view than you might think. So, for example, one of the props last year was, by June 1st, will the New York Times publish at least 3 investigative pieces on distinct topics concerning McKinsey and Company? So that prop was proposed and seconded by a couple of my friends who are also McKinsey alums. And it's an interesting question, right? There's a state of the world in which the New York Times is super excited about publishing a lot of investigations about McKinsey. At the time, in January of 2020, Pete Buttigieg was still in the presidential race. And so that gave the Times some reason to do more publication on that topic. But if you were to do research on the base rate of how often the Times publishes these pieces, you would find, as I did with a quick search, that there was about one article on a distinct topic every other month. So think of it, I think it was like a 0.48 articles per month rate at which the Times was publishing pieces on McKinsey. So you can extrapolate from that to the amount of time between post time and June 1st and say, all right, well, you make a normal distribution here and figure out the odds that the number is 3 or more. And, I came up with I think a forecast of whatever it was, 30%. And it turned out not to hit. In that case, it was a 0. But the point is, there is research you can do on base rates that is more common than you think.
Talk to me about some of the implications of this in terms of how you advise clients. It seems that there's some that naturally would arise, like the part around teamwork and getting different points of view on a topic. There's something around avoiding overconfidence and being concerned about that. But tell me about how some of this has manifested in your advisory work.
So my advisory work is divided in half between investors and corporates. Investors, especially long, short, public equity hedge funds are basically doing this kind of forecasting all day long. They are making repeated small bets on specific stocks and the drivers of those stocks and trying to come up with an out of consensus view on what will drive these stocks to go higher or lower. That is an exercise in super forecasting. And when I was working at a hedge fund full time most recently, everybody very enthusiastically joined this contest and entered, and were super excited about simply sharpening their super forecasting toolkit. As it happens, they did not perform better than the average forecaster in the contest, but they still entered somewhat enthusiastically and probably built their skills along the way. And continuous improvement really is the goal of the contest. I try not to focus too much on the overall winner of the contest. I should point out that the stakes of this contest are a bowl of pho, of Vietnamese noodle soup, and a book that I've selected for people to read. So I don't have pitched battles of people fighting with the judges about whether I called the outcome correctly on this proposition. But maybe the pho is not enough to motivate the hedgies to make even better forecasts. But they certainly can benefit from having better super forecasting skills. Then, if you think about the corporate clients that are closer to the example you gave about doing a budgeting or a kind of a strat planning function or a diligence function, these skills do come in handy if they merely force you to think about the problem from different angles, to not be overconfident, to create more scenarios, to identify the drivers that really matter. There is certainly an advantage that comes to you at being a better forecaster when you're doing the financial planning and analysis function within an existing client, to think about all the different techniques you might use, like base rate forecasting, deciding between trend following and mean reversion, triaging the problem so that you are not spending too much time on drivers that are never going to matter. All of that matters, as well as the point you made about teamwork. I would also say there is something to the idea of meta rationality, knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. The winners of the contest last year was a team. Some teams go by code names. So this team goes by the name Obsequious Fog, which was the code name that was randomly generated for them in the first contest, where I gave everybody code names because I thought that's what they wanted. In fact, people are very happy to have their names out in the open here. But Obsequious Fog had a very, call it low confidence strategy, where they took the 50-50 on about 6 of the propositions. And then for the other 19, they basically made them all at the 25% or 75% level for all of them. And that level of low confidence paid off, because when you're wrong on I think they got everything almost entirely directionally right. But if you're wrong on a 75-25 prop, it's not as bad as being wrong with a 90-10. And even though some of the props were kind of obvious, I would say in advance, there was a proposition which was Amazon will spin off AWS as a separate company by August 1st. Now, sitting there in January, if you have some familiarity with corporations as you do, you would know that a spinoff of that size, which would be absolutely gargantuan, spinning off 100 billion plus, company, would take much more than 7 months to pull off, right? You could conceive of it, you could vote on it, you could imagine people making that plan, but to actually execute on that spinoff in that amount of time was almost a 0%.
I mean, even if the government had mandated it, it's like
right, exactly, right.
It's not going to happen.
Exactly. So a number of forecasters who are perhaps not business types might look at that and say, yeah, I bet the government's going to crack down on them. It's on this contest for a reason. I'm going to put a high number. Whereas a lot of people, including super forecasters, including experts in business, gave that almost a 0% chance of happening, which is correct. But Obsequious Fog stuck to their meta-rational heuristic of putting that one at, I believe, 25%. Not because that's what they thought it truly was, but they said, you know what, if we're gonna be underconfident, we're gonna be underconfident everywhere, and it's gonna serve us well. So that's what they did, and it worked out for them. And I think the goal is not to be so underconfident in everything you do in business that you put every proposition as a mushy 50-50. It's to know when you should dial back your certainty and put a range around things, and perhaps put in place some measures to mitigate the damage that comes if you turn out to be wrong.
We had an exercise in business school, which I still remember, which was we had, I think it was like it might have been in a classroom setting, so you didn't have time to do a lot of research, but it was a series of maybe 10 questions, and each one you had to put a range that would encapsulate the answer to that. And the trick to it was that you could make the range whatever you want, but you had to try to get 9 out of 10 correct in terms of within the range. So it was really about playing with the range, with sort of the range of your confidence range on those. And
so you're supposed to put 0 to a billion, right? Isn't that the winning move?
Well, you could, right? But if you did that for all of them, then you would get 10 out of 10 and you would lose, right? So the goal was to get 9 out of 10 correct, 9 out of 10 within range. So if you just said like everything is from negative infinity to positive infinity, you'd get 10 out of 10, right? But the goal was to get, I think, 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 to sort of get the right confidence range. And I think a lot of people ended up just being overconfident on their guess. So if they say, okay, what's the GDP of the United States or something, their range might have been, they think, oh, I think it's, I don't know, 30 trillion, let's say. And I'm just guessing. I have no idea what it is. 22 trillion? I have no idea. So they say, oh, it's like 28 to 32 trillion, right? Instead of saying, oh, I'm not sure, it's like 10 to 50 trillion, giving a wide enough range. So it's sort of along the similar lines of trying to teach you about estimating what your, how confident are you on something and avoiding that overconfidence. Without just completely saying it could be anything from negative infinity to positive infinity.
That's right. Yeah, you learn not only the perils of overconfidence, but how truly gettable some of these base rate numbers are. Right. It will take you 10 seconds to Google the answer to that question. Whereas other questions like a proposition in the contest last year was New York City will report more homicides in the summer of 2020 than in the summer of 2019, and there's a certain amount of research you need to do there, right? You might have an instinct about the answer there. Certainly sitting there in January of 2020, you had no reason to believe that there was going to be such a strong spike in homicides in the summer then. But you have the ability to do some amount of research to at least inform yourself with the historical answers and to bound that uncertainty around there, and to put that, call it the 80% confidence interval around what you think the numbers will be. And when you're making this forecast, your time is scarce and you're competing with other forecasts you're trying to make, both in the contest and in business. And so you learn how to get just the right amount of information to make quick decisions. And that may be a more important lesson as well.
Now, if I recall correctly, I haven't read Super Forecasters by Philip Tetlock. I've certainly heard a lot about it. Tyler Cowen talks a lot about it a lot. And I think he interviewed Philip Tetlock on his podcast recently. And that was a good episode. Yeah. And if I recall in that, it's the case that in his research, it's often the case that non-experts can do quite well at this. And his term, not mine, but apparently, there's been some housewives that participate in Philip Tetlock's research that do better than CIA analysts at forecasting some world events, just possibly because they're less biased or more just open to taking a clean slate approach and looking at open source research and not being biased by something confidential they might know. What would you say companies should do, or investors that are trying to get better at forecasting in terms of the way they recruit or train or promote the talent who are doing roles like that, like strategic planning or investing or making bets on new markets or new products?
Well, here's where I'm going to express my lack of true confidence in the answer to that question. I will say I can observe which people are super forecasters and who does well in the contest over and over again. How much of that is based on them deliberately sharpening their skills versus having some inherent set of attributes and therefore surviving through a selection effect? Very hard for me to say. So if an organization wants to benefit from the lessons of super forecasting, at a minimum, it can encourage people to to make a lot of predictions about the business and to have internal prediction markets. It can certainly study the people who do well and do poorly in these contexts. And it can try the training approach, right? How much of this is a selection effect and how much is a treatment effect? You can certainly try giving people this training and see if they perform better in their forecasts over time. I don't know of a company that's deliberately done that. I believe Tedlock gives lectures at companies, and there are certainly lots and lots of these contests for people to enter. And there's a lot of academic work that's been written about corporate prediction markets. But I would say, like everything else in my analytics practice, a lot of this is about experimentation, test and learn, try to see what works for your company, and see if super forecasting actually leads you to make better decisions.
I mean, it sounds like one idea could be for companies to run a process like yours internally and get people to participate and volunteer and in making predictions in advance across a wide range of topics, not just purely related to the business, to raise more awareness of that variability and identify people internally who are quite good at it.
Well, it's funny, right? Because the types of forecasting that go on inside of companies are NCAA March Madness pools, which are a different set of skills entirely, and where you actually do have an artificial incentive to be an extremist and to pick upsets relative to what you believe is actually going to happen. The true Bayesian who's entering a March Madness contest, if they want to have the lowest error rate possible, is going to pick the higher seed in each game. But that's not the way to win a winner-take-all tournament, because of the number of participants typically. So that probably is teaching the wrong thing. I would say if you did want to usefully sharpen your skills within a corporate setting, the more classic examples are around having people predict how long it will take to do a certain IT implementation, or even to predict what sales are going to be in some far out period where there isn't any moral hazard, there isn't any particular way for these employees to really affect the outcome to steer the results in a certain way, and where the wisdom of the crowd turns out to be more accurate than perhaps what senior leadership is telling other stakeholders is the answer that they believe is going to happen.
It seems that my guess is that culturally, many companies would be reluctant to do that because it's almost a way of saying that the executives aren't all knowing and omniscient, and that there may be people in the company who have better insight than the CEO on things.
I think it is for brave companies that are hyper rational, and it is probably the sort of thing that could be adapted to a context where the information is contained and where perhaps a smaller group of participants are aware of the results and can study it. I would welcome this kind of transparency in any company that I'm running, but not every company is culturally ready for that, and I totally appreciate that.
Well, this sounds like a really fun way of getting a group of friends together and learning together. And thank you so much for sharing. This is an idea that I think I'm thinking about now. That sounds like something that would be fun to do with a group of people. So thanks a lot for getting on the show and sharing what you've been doing.
I appreciate it. And if people want to learn more about it, they can go to my blog, braff.co. There is an entire series of blog posts at braff.co/advice, which I posted last year in the topic called Forecasting Masterclass, in which I tracked that contest as it progressed along the way in real time. And that is where you'll find a lot of tips and tricks about how to be a super forecaster.
That's awesome. And do you publish the list of questions? It sounds like you do a lot of research and work to come up with the list of questions. If someone wanted to piggyback on that, and next January when you start your contest and maybe use your questions, do you publish those?
I do. Everyone should feel free to copy the format, the questions, whatever they like. I publish the questions and the leaderboard as well. So it's all out there for anyone who's interested in this topic.
Fantastic. We will include a link in the show notes. Adam, thanks so much for joining today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Will.